Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon for this Principles of Management System Risk webinar. My name is Martin Graham and I'm the Training Manager here at NQA. Make sure that everyone's happy and then we'll begin the webinar. There's quite a few slides on this which we'll run through. I'll go into as much detail as we can, but obviously this is a big area, as probably most of you realise, and we could spend for a lot of time talking about it. But the idea of this is just to give you a bit of an overview, a bit of a flavour of kind of the risk-based side of things and the principles that are involved with it. So, just to start then, what is risk? Obviously something we hear about and think about all day and every day, but basically it's the effect of uncertainty. So when we're talking about it from ISO speak, this is really the uncertainty associated with your management system. We'll go into that in a bit more detail as we go along. Obviously this relates to the risk associated with intended results, enhancing desirable effects, preventing undesirable effects, and achieving improvements. Now, these ideas have always been implicit within ISOs. I think most of you have had ISO or certification for any period of time. Remember this idea of preventative action, and whilst that's been taken out of the standard in name, the principles of it are still there. It's this idea of being proactive and within your management system, so that you're not kind of waiting for something to happen before you react to that. Really, what you've got to look at within your management system is where there is risk and uncertainty. And from my experience, typically that sits around kind of four main areas. Really, this isn't obviously an absolute list, but it's worthy of consideration. And that's around people, the process, the product itself, or indeed the infrastructure and the environment that you're working in. All those kind of four key areas can have risks associated with them. What you're looking for really when it comes to risk is uncertainty. And once you've established or determined that uncertainty, you can address the risk associated with it. So it's really just about getting the ideas of establishing the uncertainties associated with your management system, whatever that may be. So risk can apply to any management system. And now obviously that's largely, it was introduced essentially within risk-based thinking within the 2015 versions of 9001 or 14001, but that's now with the Annex SL structure finding its way obviously into 45001 and 27001 and so on. Obviously one thing to remember is that it's not necessarily risk associated with health and safety or your aspects and impacts. It really is around the risks associated with achieving intended results. That's what the standard's asking for. So in plain English, really keeping it simple as that, what's in doubt that could affect what we do, and that obviously has associated uncertainties, and that's where you start getting into the risk side of things. So the types of risks then, obviously they're many and varied. Obviously you look at the key kind of areas there. You obviously got financial risk, that's something that we're all exposed to. Compliance risk when it comes to your product or environmental, health and safety, or any kind of regulatory issue that you may come across. Human risks, obviously you've got people's, the variables that the ultimate variable that are people within your business and in the world. So obviously you've got uncertainties associated with those. Environmental and health and safety risks, you've got obviously compliance issues there and areas that you can be exposed to as a business commercially and regulatory. Perception, how people can see you as a business and your products and your service and what you provide, that can be something that can be at risk essentially. So you need to look at what's uncertain about that, how it can be protected and so on. Operational risk, that's obviously a big area. You can spend an awful lot of time on that. So you've really got the beginning to end of your production or service provision process. So the idea is that you look at kind of each of the stages within those processes and figure out what the failure points are and what you can address and what's uncertain. And then infrastructure, you look at all these things, you've got things like equipment and the buildings and space and vehicles and so on. There's any number of things that can essentially kind of trip you up, so to speak, and can prove a failure point within your business. All these points kind of really boil down to the business risk and ultimately the risk associated with your management system. So The effect of uncertainty, or an uncertainty that affects. It's an unusual kind of phrase, but ultimately they do kind of go hand in hand. Obviously, within ISO, it's defined as the former, so the effect of uncertainty. So what's not known, what's not absolute, and the effects associated with that. Or if once you've identified that uncertainty, that can obviously affect your business, and you need to kind of look at the next stage and the actions that come out of that, which is what we're saying there. So the latter can determine the risk. So once you determine the uncertainty, you can look at the risk associated with that. Obviously, whichever way you fall on this, risk is involved and the output's the same, and that output basically is an action to address the risk as very best you can, and is practicable to do so within the size and scale of your business. Obviously, once you take an action to address your risk, you typically address an uncertainty associated with that risk. As we've seen, it does go kind of hand in hand. There's, that you can talk about the terms an awful lot, uncertainty and risk, but basically they're one and the same. They should be read in conjunction with each other. So contextual risks, obviously in plain English, are relevant uncertainties. So basically the standard now, I'm sure most of you are aware, or if not all of you, at the very beginning of the standard talks about this idea of context. So everything that you do in terms of risk has to be relevant to what you do. I mean, there will be some general ones or generic ones, as we've seen previously, financial and resource and so on and so forth. But obviously you've got to keep them relevant to you and what you do as a business, and relevant uncertainties that are you can because in that way then you can identify the actions and keep them relevant and in keeping with what you do. So risk-based thinking, obviously big area of this. As I said before, we could spend an awful lot of time on this, but really just to kind of outline some of the principles that hopefully will give you a bit of a steer when it comes to looking at risk within your ISO system. So thinking, it should be systematic within your system. It's not something that should stand alone. It should kind of be inherent in what you do and run through every part of your business. Don't treat it as a standalone part of what you do. Get as many people involved and as many departments and areas and thoughts on the whole thing as possible. It can exist with any part of the process, the system, or functions of what you do. So it's not just necessarily at the beginning or the end, or associated once the product or the service is in use. It can flag itself up at any stage, and that's really where what we're looking at as auditors is we're kind of challenging, have you given consideration to the various steps and kind of within your processes that can trip you up, the failure points essentially. Obviously, not all processes carry or will be exposed to the same level of risks. For example, if you've got a business that relies heavily upon for example, a procurement process such as subcontractors or suppliers, that could be an area that you maybe focus on a bit more essentially or arguably than if you're it's just an organisation that relies upon consumables and so on as a procurement perspective. So consider that kind of that risk level when you're looking at your processes and ultimately the effect they have on essentially the importance of the business and what you're trying to achieve. Obviously, identifying and addressing risks, it should be proactive rather than reactive. We mentioned earlier on about this idea of preventative action no longer being in the standard, but essentially it is still there in this format of risk-based thinking and determining risks associated. So really don't wait for something to happen to react upon it. Obviously things do happen and you have to react to those, but the idea of being proactive with the risk and risk-based thinking is that you capture those before you fall down that hole, so to speak. Obviously, you will find, and certainly I find, and many organisations that you go into, people are doing this kind of as part and parcel of what they do as their business. It's nothing unusual to them. It's only when they get challenged on it in a particular way or asked a question about it during an audit, it kind of throws them a little bit. But when you really break it down and say, look, okay, what are you trying to achieve as part of your business in line with your policy and so on and so forth, it then starts to kind of you kind of reverse engineer it, if you like, and say, okay, what can stop you from getting from where you need to be? So the key really is to kind of recognizing to what you're already doing and how that can be relevant to you as when it comes to risk-based thinking. So don't try and reinvent a whole new process. Chances are you're going to be, you're going to have a lot in place in any case. So obviously risk by very nature, I guess, same as with auditing, it's got a kind of a negative kind of connotation, but obviously it can have its positive elements as well. Obviously, if you think of competition, it is a risk to you as a business and an organisation, but that can lead to kind of positive effects and opportunities. You know, you might start to look at your efficiencies and other opportunities and markets and so on. So what's considered negative, it doesn't necessarily always have to be that way. Obviously, the standard talks about risks and opportunities. So obviously think of opportunities off the back of this risk-based thinking process. Obviously, risk-based thinking, it allows you to consider current situation, the possibilities for and impacts of change. It's change is obviously something that happens inevitably to all of us in one form or another, and we have to adapt that as very best we can. Obviously, the idea with risk-based thinking is you try and foresee and be as proactive in that as you possibly can. The changes could be around, there's a short section on change coming up a bit later on, but that could be around people or processes or regulatory, and all of these can affect what you do and the associated risks. Obviously, at some point in the process, you might consider a risk to be acceptable. It's, you know, there's risk associated with getting up and driving your car and whatever it may be every day. But obviously, when it comes to business, you know, competition, it's a risk that has to be there. It's always going to be there. So whilst you may accept it, but obviously you just need to look at, you know, the advantages, if you like, of spending time and money on taking action associated with that. So basically, what it is, the thing to keep in mind is ultimately with risks, it's the risk associated with and of indeed achieving the intended objectives of the management system, conformity of your products and services, and achieving intended outcomes that are to be considered. So what you're looking for here, if you take it back to kind of square one, if you like, you look at your policy, you know, that sets out some high level ideas and for improvement and compliance and conformity and so on and so forth. You really kind of want to go back to those kind of those core principles and say, okay, what within our business can affect us from achieving what you're trying to really achieve in line with our policy. And obviously that can take into consideration environmental and health and safety as well. So you really want to just like look back and say, okay, take a step back if you like, and you know, don't look at it too forensically. Just look at what you're trying to achieve as business in terms of customer focus and so on and so forth, improvement, and say, well, okay, what are the pitfalls? Where can we fall down here? Obviously, remember your context. It's very, very important. You know, it's something to keep things in context. The word I use during audits sometimes instead of context is relevance. Keep things relevant to you as a business, individuals, organisations, or the industry as a whole, and that will help you in your process. Also, it's not new. It's not new risk-based thinking. It's I think we all kind of hear it to death, so to speak. You know, everyone all talks about risks day in, day out, but it's not new concepts. You know, just for the very fact that businesses are up and running and they're successful and they're operating, they're addressing risks. All the standards doing really is that missing kind of 20% and saying, okay, just get this formalized, look at the actions and review essentially the effectiveness of the whole thing of what you're doing as a normal part of your daily operation. And it's a continual thing as well. Obviously, it doesn't stop. It's subject to a kind of review and effectiveness review, and you know, reducing the risk overall. As I've already said, obviously consequences can vary by organisation, product and service. If there's high levels of compliance or you know traceability or regulatory obligations, then you do need to factor those into your risk-based thinking. Keep it simple. Obviously, as with most things, it's easy to overcomplicate you know, an idea or a process. Just really kind of look at what you're doing as an organisation and what is uncertain. You know, really kind of just take it back to the whole kind of plan, do, check, act side of things, which we'll come on to in a little while. But just keep the whole thing simple. Don't over-engineer it, and the next point, very important, kind of getting involvement of people, get people involved in the process. Obviously, you know, as an individual, we can think of X amount of things, but obviously once you've got different eyes and ears and thoughts and people involved in the processes and you know the steps in the process that you're looking at, they may look at things in a completely different way. You know, risk can be a subjective thing, you know, so the more kind of ideas and thoughts and input you've got onto it, the better. It will help you in your process, and it would also as well, it will help to identify actions to address them, which is really obviously the logical step which you're looking at after once you've identified your risks. Look obviously at what issues can affect your organisation's values. You know, obviously that's an area we've all got our own values, be it the ethical or so on and so forth. Look at the performance issues we've already spoken about, be that financial or whatever it may be. Look at your perception and knowledge and how can these issues affect your objectives. That's the thing to remember as well, is obviously when an organisation sets objectives, which you part of your ISO compliance, you really want to look at kind of, okay, where can we maybe not achieve these objectives that we're trying to get to? And obviously objectives can be very, again, varied and many. So you really want to look at the risk associated with that as well, not achieving your objectives, the objectives of the management system, because they can all lead back to these areas that you want to focus on. Obviously, action. Things have to be practical. We all live in the real world, and we've all got livings to earn and so on and so forth. But obviously, don't if you reviewed it and you want to accept it, there might be cases where you want to avoid things, eliminate things altogether, substitute, manage the likelihood or the consequence. You may even decide to accept and manage the risk, or to some degree, if there's an opportunity associated with it, you might want to pursue it because it may lead to something bigger and better for you. As you said just before, there obviously the actions. Once you've determined all your actions, you've got to evaluate the risks. Determine the risks. You've got to look at the actions and how it all works. Keep things in context and proportionate. Kind of don't throw money or time at something that's ultimately going to, it's going to be counterproductive. You really need to keep things relevant. As I've already said there, preventive action is not necessarily gone, and whilst it's not in the standard anymore in that name, if you prefer it and people understand it, and it's something that I've discovered, I sometimes go back to the term of, preventative action. What can you do to prevent things from going wrong? And ironically, people can kind of tend to grasp that idea a little bit. Not necessarily better, but it can be something a bit more kind of digestible than the term risk, because it's risk does tend to have a association with kind of health and safety, and which is obviously relevant. But when it comes to management system risk, you're looking at this idea of preventing things from happening. So obviously, when you're looking at risk-based thinking, essentially it's enabling your organisations to determine the factors that could cause your processes in its management system, said quality management system there, but it's essentially any management system, to deviate from the planned results, to put in place preventive controls to minimise negative effects and to maximise the use of opportunities. So they're the key things there. It's what you're planning to do. It's the planned results of the management system. Now, obviously, they can be, as we've already said, anything from achieving your objectives to compliance through to production efficiency or whatever it may be, keeping people safe and happy, obviously, and well. Obviously, they're the planned results, preventing pollution. There's any number of things that you could think about as what you're trying to achieve and what is planned as part of your management system. And you really need to take that step back and say, okay, what can trip us up here? No correct methodology. Again, there's many. I'm sure you've all seen familiar things like risk matrices and tables and likelihood, severities, and consequence. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. The only wrong way essentially is to not do it, and be able to kind of discuss the concepts and principles of it. Obviously, the methodology that you choose, there's many of them out there. We'll mention a handful as we go through, but we'll obviously to just give you an idea of some of the principles and ideas of it. So obviously, whilst you may not be able to eliminate the uncertainties, this is key. You certainly will be able to manage the effects. So obviously, the uncertainties to some degree will always be there. It's just part and parcel of life. But obviously, it's how you manage the effects, and that's really what we're looking at within the management system. They exist, but what are you doing about the whole thing to mitigate them? Obviously, once you've established, kind of what the processes are, obviously, and they can be varied within an organisation. Look at the failure points. Kind of where can you trip over? What are the holes you can slow down, so to speak? And obviously, that will have associated risks with it that you can start to develop out your actions. As you said, obviously, this perception of risk, obviously, having a broader resource input certainly will, from my own experiences, it helps to highlight unnoticed risks. Obviously, that has to be, relevant to the scale of the organisation. If there's one person or two people, then get them involved. But you don't necessarily want 500 people involved, but you can get kind of groups of people and facilitate the whole thing, get people's thoughts and input on the whole thing. One step at a time, take it slowly. Obviously, just look at determine the risk, and then look at the ratings. Come later, you can just look at don't necessarily over-reg the whole thing. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated. Joined up thinking, it's a bit of a cliche, but it does work. Obviously, the more people you've got talking and understanding the same thing, the more relevant it can be, and the more people kind of will engage with the whole thing. So if you find that someone has volunteered an idea or come up with something, or even a solution associated with it, that will help them kind of engage and get involved with the whole thing. Obviously, documentation when it comes to risk. Obviously, aside from health and safety risk, which is a different animal, when you look at management system risk, obviously necessary. Certainly, if you feel that it's necessary, document the risks. If it helps you manage, obviously, to be able to track and trace the whole thing. There's a bit of a disconnect to some degree with the standards. Obviously, the standards require slightly different things, so it's worth having a look at those risk-based clauses within there. Just to give you an example, obviously within 9001, you don't have to document your risks, risk and opportunities, but within 14001, it's a slight variation, and it says you've got to document those that need to be addressed. So it's a slight, a bit of a play on words and its semantics maybe, but it does just have a little read and a digest of what the standards are asking for if you're there. So don't fall down the trap of generating documentation if you don't need to, or you don't feel it's necessary. It all has to be of value to you as an organisation. As we said, they're addressing some risks. It may identify opportunities. It's as I said, we mentioned suppliers. Obviously, it may find that if you had a problem with a particular supplier, looking around and trying to address that, it may source a better alternative. So it's not necessarily always a bad thing. Arguably, in everything we do, there's uncertainty in everything. It's from the beginning to end. The key process here is to identify, evaluate the effect, and determine the action is the fundamental concept of risk-based thinking there. So really just whatever part of your business and organization or your management system that you look at, there's going to be some uncertainties there, and the idea is that the standard asks you just to look at those, evaluate them, obviously keeping things relevant. There's just you don't need to go down to nitty-gritties, but obviously just look at where you are and how you can operate and what can affect it. So the possible effects then, obviously quite a few here. Obviously, you're not expected, don't remember these, and I obviously won't go in vast amounts of detail in everyone, but just to give you kind of an idea of some risks that we come across during, or could arguably expected to see as part of our auditing process. Obviously, customer requirements not met is a usual suspect. Obviously, product knowledge. If an organisation you don't understand necessarily what a product is required to do or expected to perform, there's risk associated with that or uncertainty. Obviously, a fundamental one, wrong product delivered or late delivery, incorrect material used. There could be issues associated with that if people aren't necessarily, if there's traceability involved, and obviously there can be, you need to make sure that the controls are in place with that. Obviously, contamination or damage. Now that can be the product itself, or it can be with regard from environmental. There can be issues associated with that. Resources, usually the biggest variable in any organisation. Obviously, you've got uncertainties there with regards to individuals' competence, training, awareness, availability, even, have you got the people to do the job? And if there's the knowledge suitable, it can all be areas that you might want to consider. Obviously, accidents, they're uncertain. Nobody, is associated with them. Nobody wants them, but they happen. Resource succession failure, obviously something that comes up on nearly every audit that you go on. You talk about kind of succession planning and so on. You say, well, okay, what's the uncertainty there? Well, the uncertainty is that we may not have the knowledge or the resources to carry on for 5, 10, 15 years. And obviously, the idea is that you factor some of that into your planning process. Supply chain, a big area. It's procurement can be obviously a big area when it comes in every sense of the word, through to the product or service, through to uncertainties about competence and so on and so forth. Obviously, financial instability and overspend, it's a big variable for all of us. Something that you might want to consider. Doesn't necessarily come up during ISO audits, but it can, because finances aren't an area that we necessarily delve into, but it can be part of the bigger picture when you're looking at your business continuity and so on. Obviously, communication, language barriers, if you're from a health, any perspective, but certainly health and safety, if there's difficulty understanding, that can lead to uncertainty and risk associated with people performing their tasks and so on. Compliance breach, again, obviously nobody wants that, but it can happen. Process inefficiency, look at kind of how things are working. Are they performing as you intend? Are they as you intend them to? And if not, kind of why not? There may be an underlying issue there that's a risk that's causing that, and you can get to the bottom of. Infrastructure issues, Obviously, maintenance and suitability is it fit for purpose? And is it being able to provide you with the environment and infrastructure that you need? So look at the uncertainties associated with that. With is the equipment being maintained? Is there do people know how to use it? Is it running inefficiently? Whatever it may be. And obviously, change, we've already mentioned there, uncontrolled change. It's change happens. It's part of that. But obviously, with uncontrolled change, it's got an inherent risk and uncertainty with it. So you'd look at how that can be enacted. Reputation, obviously, we've all got a reputation to uphold, and there can be uncertainties and risks associated with that. So look at kind of how these points can affect you and what you do. And obviously, there's quite a few there. That it's not exhaustive. It's just kind of a little bit of an idea of kind of the sort of things that we come across and discuss during audits. They may affect you all or none, or certainly some of you, but they're little areas to take into consideration. So the benefits then, there must be hopefully there's some benefits to all this risk-based process, aside from obviously compliance with the standard. Objectives, again, it's a key and fundamental thing. It sits in line with your policy and arrangements. So you look at the improve the likelihood of achieving those. Consistency of your output, be that efficiency or number or on-time delivery, whatever it may be, you can start to factor into that once you've addressed the uncertainties. Having some confidence in your system, in your deliverables, obviously, that's ultimately what it's all about, in terms of compliance and your customer. It can help to establish a proactive culture of improvement. Obviously, the standards all require continual improvement. So once you start to iron out or certainly determine, address those uncertainties, it can lead to this, it can help to kind of establish and improve this culture of improvement. Naturally, obviously, it can assist with your audit compliance, something that we all need to do, and obviously in statutory and regulatory compliance as well. You look at the potential issues, and once you start to mitigate those, it can help you with those compliance issues, the compliance process. Operational efficiency and governance. Once you start to look at kind of the whole process, and you start to say, okay, whether perhaps there's duplication or obviously inefficiencies or lack of understanding, you can obviously start to address those issues, because all those things will have risks associated with them or uncertainties. And again, kind of bringing up again effectiveness of your change management. So the idea is that you would you'd look at kind of how effective that whole process is and manage your changes through that. Now there's a few more. I think try to think of as many of these as we could to make it as a value added. Obviously, your knowledge base, keep that in mind. Obviously, enhancing and expanding your knowledge, it can address uncertainties within what you do. Obviously, stakeholder perception, we've spoken about that previously, the idea of this perception of what you do and the uncertainties associated with it. System and operational resilience, obviously you can look at kind of how things, make a more stable system, and ultimately you've got some resilience built in there. Obviously, management system effectiveness, which is something that we look at as part of our audits, how effective the system is as part and parcel of your business operation. Naturally, preventing negative effects, which is one of the fundamental ideas, as well as obviously achieving intended results. The idea is, if you're being proactive, you'll start to prevent these things. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, reliability of your products and services. The idea is if you're getting rid of the uncertainties, chances are you're going to produce something or provide something that's certainly more consistent. And obviously, they're not exhaustive. It's really just to give you an idea of kind of the reasons why we look for and do these things, and the risk-based thinking approach that's been employed. Okay, so looking at the Plan, Do, Check, Act thing, I'm sure you've all heard this many times, but we'll just have a quick kind of run through kind of the clauses associated with the standards and the Plan, Do, Check, Act side of things. So obviously, clause 4, that's really kind of this idea of your context, are you interested parties, as I said before. So basically, the idea of that section 4 is that it really kind of gets you looking at and focusing on the relevance of the management system, processes, and the risks associated with it. So the interested parties, the scope of the management system, and so on. So that really is that's your starter for 10, if you like. That's where the whole thing begins. So going into clause 5, another much enhanced clause on previous standards. This idea of obviously top management must engage with the whole thing. There's requirements there of promotion and application of risk-based thinking. So the idea is that obviously previously there was a requirement for commitment. So yes, management had to get things done, but now they have to actively be involved in the process as well. So, and that can obviously, that leading from the front or the top or whatever it may be, that will help in your risk-based approach. 6 is with obviously the planning side of things, which is where the risks and opportunities clause sits, along with things like objectives and so on, and the associated actions. Obviously, that demands that you identify risks and take action to address those as practically as you can. Once you've done all that a lot, obviously you have to resource the whole thing. Now, obviously, that can you know, in terms of time and process and whatever that may be, infrastructure and so on. So it's all very well identifying the risks and determining the actions, but you need to resource the whole thing to make it as effective as possible. Obviously, clause 8 is about your operational control, which obviously that covers across all the standards, the Annex SL standards or structure standards. So the idea is that once you've done all the determined, got the leadership involved, got your risks, got the resources, okay, now we need to go to work and make things happen and you know, and influence and take these actions as we need to. Then on to the next stage. Once this is obviously the checking side of things. How effective are the actions? You know, you've determined, you've done all the hard work, so now you want to know whether or not it's actually having any kind of effect and indeed being effective with the whole thing. So look at what you've done, evaluate the performance. Is it having an effect? Do you need to change tack? Do you need to reevaluate your risks or the actions and so on? Keep it live and up to date. It's you know, it should be a living thing in your system. And obviously clause 10 there talks about continual improvement. It's a mandatory requirement of the standard, and it kind of naturally is the last piece of the puzzle, if you like, when it comes to the plan, do, check, act cycle. You know, there should be some evidence that you're improving, either via reducing your risks, or you look at the effectiveness of the system and so on. So there they are basically. I mean, in terms of just putting it in another little, different words, but same words, but a different kind of format, really. Obviously, looking at that plan side of things. So plan is your leadership, obviously, in identifying and assessing your actions and your risks and everything. That's your planning element. Doing, obviously, implement the actions, communicate it. Key there. Don't try and do it on your own or within 1 or 2 people. Again, the more people involved in the doing and implementation phase can be much of much benefit to you as an organisation. Obviously, check, monitor what you're doing. It's you know, with regards to risk, obviously that can be any number of means. That can be through, you know, physical monitoring or data monitoring and so on. So the idea is that you get a flavour for kind of how well your system is reacting to what you're doing in the operations and the people within it. Okay, and obviously on the final phase there, obviously once you've implemented, done the check-in and you kind of reviewed where you are, obviously then act on anything. You know, if there may be changes that need to be made, don't just leave it static and standing there. Look at what you're doing and see if you can, you know, you can act to improve upon it, and then that will lead back to input as an input to your planning phase once that comes around once again. So risk-based thinking then, there's this obviously within the whole thing, there's this idea of a management program. There's kind of 5 main steps, and they're pretty straightforward. Obviously, we could spend an awful lot of time going through each of these individually, but we'll just give you a bit of an idea of what this is all about. So obviously, identify the risk. That's fundamental. What's uncertain here? What do we need to do? Analyze it, so you can see how this all fits in with the plan, do, check, act side of things. So okay, get your criteria in place, however you want to analyze it, give a numerical value, red, amber, green, whatever you feel is working for you guys. Obviously then treat it, that's the action phase. So obviously doing something about it, you know, once you've identified it and evaluated, do something about the whole thing. Keep it under review, so your check-in phase. And then obviously then there's the control side of things, which leads on to the actual, you know, the actual operational control of your risks to make sure things are performing as they should. Some possible methodologies, obviously there's quite a few out there. I'm sure the common ones, if you like, some things that we come across. Obviously SWOTs, that's your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. It's usually a good starting point, because, you know, obviously you're looking at a weakness that can be, and threat certainly that can be an area for looking at risk. PESTLES, obviously that's That's another acronym for political, environmental, social, technological, legislative, and economic. So different areas, different factors within the business and criteria that you might want to consider that could have a risk associated with them. FMEA, failure mode effect analysis. It can look at the individual failure modes within a business or process or product and look to seek to where the uncertainties and risks may be. Obviously, ISO 31000, that's a dedicated standard to risk management that goes into a bit more detail with regards to kind of how risk can be determined and managed. It's an entire standard dedicated to that, but the principles, you don't necessarily have certification to that, but you can work in accordance with, so it's worth looking up the principles and ideas behind that. Obviously, cause and effect, pretty straightforward there. Brainstorming, again, getting people involved in the whole thing. Interview and root cause analysis. These can all lead to kind of ideas and methodologies for determining risk. Now, obviously, it's not an absolute list, and you may have your own ways of doing it, but basically, they're all kind of methodologies that you can employ to kind of establish and measure risk indeed. So obviously risk and leadership, we mentioned that back at the beginning there. I know it's there's a bit of reluctance sometimes for leadership to some degree to get involved in the ISO systems. Obviously the important thing here is that obviously you can't necessarily control people through policies, procedures and policing. You can only do it through a strong risk management culture and absolute integrity in all leaders. So getting that kind of leading from the front and seeing people don't necessarily do as I say, just do as I do, and instill that culture. Obviously, asking the right questions as part of your leadership role. Challenging any underlying assumptions and engage with people. That's what's key there. Obviously leading on to the next point there, consulting with a mix of people, as I've already said. Perceptions and background and knowledge. It can all people can have all different ideas and their perception of risk, and they may come up with something that on the shop floor, so to speak, that hasn't been looked at a management level. Obviously, critical testing of ideas and assumptions. None of us like to be told that we're wrong or that we're doing something incorrect, or it could lead to a risk. But the idea is that if there's critical testing of that, it can give you some feedback and some analysis on the whole thing. So obviously, you look at your system there. Policies and procedures, obviously, for predicting, evaluating, and managing risk are important. But obviously, for leaders, if you don't ask the right question, don't seek out diversity, and don't engage, obviously, the whole system starts to break down. So do remember that within your systems there. Just look at the whole thing and try and get a feel from an engagement from leadership, because it can help the whole thing to a very great degree. Change and risk. Obviously, we've spoken about change a little bit so far. Obviously, when you've got your system in place, keep it under constant review. That can be anything from procedural changes to policies to operational product changes or people changing, whatever it may be. Obviously, and as and when those changes happen, be aware of them, because they can affect the planning phase of what you do, because it can vary the risk level there and the effect that it can have. The little point there, just as an example, obviously something as simple as changing your structure could have huge impacts. Obviously, if you want to remove a position or change a position, does it leave a gap? Can the people that are left fulfill that gap, and so on? And has a role left been unfulfilled? So obviously, it's to consider this change. The resource change is one thing, but obviously anything that you do with an organisation that can have a change can affect what you do. And obviously they can have an associated effect on the risk level and everything that goes with it. So be aware of changes. It's there's a dedicated clause in the standard to all of this, and it's something that as auditors we do have a look at, because the first question we usually ask when you go into an opening meeting, I'm sure you've heard it, is what's changed? Have there been any changes? And invariably there has been something. So you'd really want to then sort of follow just that path down, and it can be something relatively mundane. It can be an increase in turnover, whatever it may be, but associated with that there can be obviously the risks and uncertainties. So we just look to challenge that or just go a little bit deeper on that. Obviously, supply chain, it's another big area for most organisations. Not all of us do everything. We rely upon a supply chain in one form or another. So obviously, be aware of that. Obviously, they can be far and many, as I've already said. It can be down to, obviously, if it's goods, it can be around obviously counterfeit parts and parts obsolescence, material has been short or incorrect, or product safety. a supplier may change a product specification without your knowledge. So it's all these kinds of things. You want to look at your supply chain, and it's a big area. You could spend a lot of time going around supply chain risk management, but obviously just start to have a look at kind of what you do as a supply chain, how it can affect what you do. And obviously, it's not demanding that you carry out a risk assessment for each supplier, but really just look at kind of the whole thing, a category, type of perspective, and what problems can arise. So be that number, quality, compliance, whatever it may be. Obviously, if something's outsourced as a special process, so I'll give you the previous term, obviously, there's something that is within your scope of certification, but you don't do in-house, that's got some uncertainties associated with that. So we'd look to kind of challenge, or not necessarily challenge, but look at how kind of you're managing that uncertainty and risk associated with not having eyes and ears, so to speak, on the process itself. So do think about that. So just some kind of examples there, some kind of worked examples or experienced examples of kind of uncertainties and risks that we typically come across. Obviously, suppliers going out of business, it's a fundamental one. Have alternatives being considered? People not understanding their roles or responsibilities within their management system. How robust is your induction and training process and the resourcing of the whole thing? Inadequate infrastructure, so considering the maintenance and any instruction associated with it, any efficiencies, the efficiency of the whole thing, and how it's working for you as an organisation. Poor communication, it can happen. The communication clauses within all of the standards, and whilst they're very explicit, it does. The interpretation can be far and wide. So just remember that kind of the communication. It can have you look at risk, associated with communication. It can be quite a big one there. People don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it necessarily. It can be a problem. Documentation, it's a fundamental one. We've all had documentation control. Is it available? Is it up to date? Is it fit for use? Is it accurate? Is it is it legible? That kind of thing. It's kind of old school, if you like, quality control, but it can all have kind of risks and uncertainties associated with it. So just give these areas a little bit of a think. Obviously, external influences. The standard talks about interested parties. So the idea is kind of it talks about needs and expectations, but obviously that kind of goes both ways. It goes how kind of what you of them and them of you. So look at kind of what's uncertain in that regard. Kind of to what degree can they impact you and what you do as an organisation. And chances are there's going to be an uncertainty associated with that. So, I mean, that's obviously that they are purely just some little food for thought. There's nothing absolute there. They may all apply. None of them may apply, but obviously the idea is just give you an idea of the kind of ideas of risk that we look at when we're looking at during audits, and the kind of areas that we'd expect to be kind of seeing addressed, or ideas of areas that we'd expect to be seeing addressed. So, obviously a lot of slides there, a lot of words. So hopefully it's been of relevance, and it's given you some value and something else to think about. So obviously I think putting it very, very basically, and coming back to the idea of what I said kind of a little while ago, it's really kind of uncertain. What is uncertain around what you're trying to achieve, what can it affect, and how can you manage it? So really look at what you're trying to achieve, be that your policy statements, be that in line with your objectives or compliance and so on. Look at what's uncertain there, and you get people involved, and get them involved in the whole process, the planning, the doing, the checking, the acting, and so on, and you find that it can be a benefit. And I think that's the thing. Just keep it as simple as you can. Look at what you're already doing. Don't over-engineer the whole thing, and get people engaged, leadership involved, obviously fundamental, and yeah, just look at what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. And once you examine that, then you should start to identify some uncertainties associated with that. That's pretty much it. Obviously, I know it's a big area. We could talk probably certainly for a lot longer than this about it. Now we are actually putting in place and generating some training that we're planning to roll out next year and offer as NQA. The idea is to be a kind of a 2-day introduction course to risk management, which will kind of really just kind of go into a bit more detail about some of the ideas we've spoken about this afternoon, some of the principles and methodologies. So look out for that. Obviously, now you will get, as I've said, copies of this webinar and the slides and everything that goes with it on Monday morning. If there are any questions, obviously I'm going to stay online here now. There's a question section on your on your screen there. If there are any questions, I'll stay online for as long as it takes. Failing that, you can obviously get in contact us with the emails there. And if there's any kind of clustered questions, I'll reply to those in one go. And hopefully that's been of use to you. So thank you for your time, and look forward to, well, hopefully I'll be involved in the training or something sometime next year. So if there are any questions or anything you need to talk about, you can call us as well, and I'll happily take any calls and questions that you've got. So hopefully that's been of use, and enjoy your weekends. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.